Hello and welcome to this edition of In Focus, brought to you by the Uongozi Institute. I'm your host, Gwamaka Kifukwe, here at the African Leadership Forum in Kigali, Rwanda. On this edition of the program, we'll be discussing the challenge of domestic resource mobilization as we search for financing for Africa's transformation for sustainable development. Joining me to discuss this will be Professor Njuguna Ndung'u, the former governor of the Central Bank of Kenya. Professor, welcome to the program.
Thank you very much.
So we just want to start off with kind of questioning, why are we having this discussion about domestic resource mobilization now? I mean, why is it so important suddenly?
Okay. Well, let me say that it's not suddenly. I can start from there.
Sure.
Because essentially, for me, I have tackled this subject for almost 10 years now. Mm-hmm. Because I started this in 2009, when Kenya succeeded in creating an infrastructure board. Mm-hmm. I remember that time the African Development Bank thought it is an important issue, and that's when they coined the word innovative domestic resource mobilization. Mm-hmm. So it's actually not new.
Okay.
But the novelty of it is that it is very much depends on whether you have avenues for domestic resource mobilization. Mm-hmm. And yesterday when I was presenting, I presented 6 areas from taxation. Yes. And I gave example of Kenya, which for many years it was tax revenue was comprising, was financing total government expenditure, that is recurrent expenditure as well as development expenditure, to the tune of 92 to 96%, depending on the years. So you see that the fiscal gap was between 4 and 8% every year. So if you are successful with taxation, that's the first point of call, as it were. Mm-hmm. The second one, if you cannot raise adequate money from domestic resource mobilization, is to borrow domestically. Mm-hmm. And borrowing domestically is a very important aspect and answers your question, why now? Mm-hmm. Because it leads to endogenous development of endogenous market development. Mm-hmm. That is, suppose you want to raise domestic resources through government borrowing domestically, mm-hmm. then you have to come up with instruments mm-hmm. to borrow domestically. Those instruments then end up actually developing the market further. Mm-hmm. So you remember the first thing that happened in 2000 was reform of pension funds. So essentially pension funds comes in and tries to deepen the market. Mm-hmm. You have 3 sources of funds that you can actually deepen the financial market. One is the banking sector itself through deposits and all that, intermediation and all that. Second is the pension funds, and third is the insurance industry. Those are very important aspects, and if you go to the Kenyan case, which has started, and even South Africa with vibrant bond market, you'll find that those are the major players. So essentially, one of them is an intrinsic idea that you can actually raise resources domestically using domestic debt instruments. And there is a hope that you will develop the market further so that it is a market for private sector debt, public sector debt, but it can also be a market for private sector debt, isn't it? So that big companies with healthy balance sheet can also float their bonds and they can be bought in the market. So that is one very strong measure that endogenous market development becomes very, very important. The third avenue I talked about yesterday, the third and fourth, was savings. Mm-hmm. Savings are low, so it means you have to come out and look for more innovative ways. Investments are low, investment to GDP are low. Then you have to come out with a different method. The fifth is actually coming up with structured bonds. You see, there's the bond market, but then you can actually go into specific bond instruments. That is, you can go into Diaspora board, and you can go into infrastructure boards. The Kenyan way has seen that you can actually work successfully with the infrastructure bonds, and infrastructure bonds can also be bought by the diaspora. Mm-hmm. So essentially, you can actually decide to have a specific diaspora board, or you can combine diaspora board with an infrastructure board. Mm-hmm. And finally, the other domestic resource mobilization is actually development financial institutions. And yesterday, actually, the debate went, and I put it in my discussion, that you don't only have to have a development financial institution which is wholesome or even a regional one. You can even develop sectoral development financial institutions. For example, for agriculture, for industry, manufacturing and all that. And so those are different options. But at the end of it all, domestic resource mobilization is that you can raise resources when you want, and when there is need to it. There's a developmental aspect to them because they develop the market. And secondly, it becomes endogenous. Everybody is, okay, you wanted to finance that load network, everybody watches you. They will give you the money on the basis that you are going to develop that load network. And that's why it becomes very, very critical. And the third answer, why now, is because you can see that since the global financial crisis and even before that, the development financing from bilaterals was coming down. And then then from ODA, multilateral institutions are becoming weaker and weaker in terms of providing resources. Or rather, maybe the demand for resources is larger and larger every year. For many years, the resources were with governments in industrial countries. But you can see now resources have moved to the private sector. They are no longer with the public sector. They are with the private sector. So essentially, you have to see that either you have private sector at home or private sector abroad, and that's why the sovereign boards have become very, very important. So the reason why is because there is a changing resource movement or resource
the context is
context. It's a contextual issue that we really have to change with it. But the bottom line is that we can use the private sector. You can go into the international capital market, which allows you to have, there are different aspects to it because it allows you even to have a pricing mechanism for your domestic assets. And you can raise money domestically. And so you can see it's a mix of the whole thing.
So you've given us a lot to chew on there, and we'll come to different aspects of it as we go through the interview. But if we discuss domestic resource mobilization, again, coming back to the basics, what are the key considerations? I mean, what needs to be in place in order for this to be successful, for it to be optimal? I mean, you can overtax, for example. That might choke this development of the domestic market and the domestic economy and so on. So what are the considerations that decision makers need to make or need to at least keep in mind when they're talking about, I want to now mobilize domestic resources effectively for whatever purpose that might be? What are the key kind of considerations?
Yeah, let me start from your point about taxation. So essentially, I think I was listening to a debate, I think somebody must be from US or something, talking about taxation and how when you overtax, you actually kill the investment line that you wanted because you reduce disposable income. That means that you have a limit in terms of how much you can tax. African countries are also very peculiar because the tax bases are very, very shallow. Yesterday I presented the tax effort debate in the East African region. We have a target of tax effort, that is tax revenue to GDP of 25%. It's only Kenya that has managed to get to 21, 22%. All the other countries are very far from even 20%. Yet the convergence criteria is hovering around 15,
10, 11, somewhere
10, 12, 15. Yet the convergence criteria is 25. You can see how far. It's not that they are not raising, they are not managing taxation. It is because the tax base is shallow. How do you enlarge the tax base? That's a developmental aspect. But it means that overtaxing will kill domestic investments. Private sector will actually react to that. So that's a no-go zone. But also taxation is an interesting issue. You know now, right now, the fintechs are talking about crowdfunding. Taxation is a form of crowdfunding, isn't it? It's only that it takes a bit of time, isn't it?
Oh, you want to collect in between.
You want to collect taxes. You know, your income tax comes in per month. It's a small percentage. Bring it from everybody. By the time you get the maximum pot you want, it takes a bit of time. So, how do you deal with that? In economics, we used to, when we teach, we actually talk about. It doesn't matter whether you raise taxes now or borrow. It's called Ricardian equivalent. It doesn't matter whether you borrow to effect development projects or you raise taxes. In the long run, it's the same thing. But there is a limitation in terms of taxes. So the best thing is you borrow and roll out the investments you want, open up in economy, then you create capacity to pay the debt in future. That's the logic. And that's why it becomes very, very important that you can actually borrow. Then the next question is, what instruments do you use? And how do you time them? And that's where we are. That's why bond markets become very, very important. Government can come up with instruments of borrowing from the domestic market from short-term instruments, which is really work like cash flow management, to long-dated paper, which actually works and helps the market to have a yield curve.
So, and again, coming back to the kind of question, so we consider taxation quite heavily, but in order for the taxation to, at least for the principle of taxation to work, people must see value for money.
Yes,
they must see that what I'm being taxed is actually being used
Yes,
appropriately.
yes.
So what are the other kinds of, say, institutional frameworks or institutions generally that need to exist in order for us to be able to ramp up this drive for resource mobilization domestically?
You see, one of the things about value for money and taxation is about you are seeing projects that are helping you. Domestic resource mobilization is geared towards public investments, especially related to infrastructure, that helps to lower the transactions costs. So it's, in a sense, public investments that are rolled out are able to enhance the profitability of private investments. So you are signaling mechanism as a private sector or an individual who is being taxed or who is providing these resources is to see whether transactions costs are are declining and your profitability is rising. Then it means that your capacity to service or even to be taxed or even to service or government to service that debt increases. And you can see that that's the logic. So essentially, one of them is to have a very strong institution that is, and yesterday we talked about, and even today, the issue about the institution that is dealing with taxation, for example. We call them the revenue authorities. You can imagine we have come from far. They used to be part of Ministry of Finance. Now they are institutions that stand alone. The institutional structure so that they create an incentive for taxation. You know, most countries in Africa look at taxation as a penalty. Why? Is because, just like you said, you are not seeing the direct benefits. But if you start seeing the direct benefits, then things work very well. Let me tell you what we did in 2009 when we started the first infrastructure board. What we did was to ask the Ministry of Finance to provide on a quarterly basis to the private sector, to the board market participants, what has happened to the previous project that you financed with the board, with the infrastructure board. And because there would be several projects. They would give details about disbursements. The project is 20% complete, the project is 90% complete. And that gave structure, that gave incentive for even the board market players to go into the market and dip more to try and see how the board market can work. But then the revenue institution is just one institution. There is the totality of government in terms of policy profile and continuity of those policies. Remember yesterday I talked about three major problems in African economies why you find that the development is checked. Because one of them is losing focus. The moment you lose focus, even the incentive value of the taxation goes down. The second one is coordination problem. And you see that the revenue authority is doing its work, but what is happening to the funds? How are they being applied? And the public is watching. They have paid the taxes, but they're also watching what are the projects. The third one is pure weak institutions which do not guarantee the regime changes. When regime change, everything changes. You know,
including the legislation. Sometimes.
Sometimes the legislation may stay, but emphasis change. We have Vision 2030 in Kenya, and other countries have Vision. But if a new regime comes and does not remember there was Vision 2030, then everybody gets confused. So what does it do? It blurs the private sector expectations. So essentially, just coming back to you on incentives for taxation, then you find that the private sector is not feeling that there is positive externalities for them when they pay taxes. Okay. So essentially, those three problems: focus, coordination failure, and then regime changes. Regime changes blurs the expectations. That is what we need to guard against, and we can guard against that in terms of continuity. In development strategy is about continuity, and that's what the private sector looks at. But then who is to guarantee that? It's continuity, and long life of the government is the one that is going to guarantee all these aspects. So that you tax, the resource infusion goes in public investment, you can monitor those public investments, they are completed, they benefit the private sector, and all of a sudden we move to the next stage.
And I mean, one of the concerns I certainly have, and that was raised also during the discussions, was, is this a false expectation? We hear that Africa is rich, and therefore domestic resource mobilization should be a no-brainer. Right? But when you look at the structure of our economies, are a lot of them in a position to be able to apply some of these instruments that you're talking about? You know, like, where do you begin when, if we can admit that 80% of our economy is subsistence agrarian, for example? I mean, where do you begin now with that kind of a profile if you're trying to raise, you know, domestic resources for whatever developmental purpose?
You know, remember yesterday, everybody talked about we have availability of resources. We are rich. It's only that we don't know how to use resources. All resources are praded by some other people. And I remember President Kagame gave quite several examples.
Yes.
Former president of Tanzania, President Mkapa, gave a lot of examples. We enjoyed those examples. But the bottom line is that it is actually the weaknesses, the institutional weaknesses within government that destroys that. And that is the story that came out. Today, in the conclusion, it was like, we have to strengthen the institutions of government. But how many years have we talked about this? I can read, somebody was giving me examples of policy dialogue, all the way from the last 60 years, we've talked about it. But essentially, where do we start? Where do we start? One of them is actually try to create, let me say, it's a policy package that looks at the social dimension, the political dimension, as well as the economic dimension. As far as I'm concerned, the smallholder farmers gain a lot if they are guaranteed that they are going to have their produce. They can invest, isn't it? Yeah. Today in Kenya, the people use mobile phone to invest in government securities. And you can see they will continue investing in government securities as long as they have returns. But if they don't have returns, then obviously something changes then. Now, it is a question, when we talk about institutions, we also talk about how to, safeguard their economic rights.
Yes.
You remember yesterday, the debate of corruption was coming up. What is corruption? It is actually illegal extraction of economic rent for those people who are strong in government, extracting from those people who are weak and out of government, isn't it? Because essentially, it's extraction, it's public resources that are being extracted. It's illegal extraction of economic rent. To the point where you are actually going to extract economic rent coming from smallholder farmers who have a big cooperative, let's say tea cooperative, and then you extract their resources, then you're going to condemn them to poverty. And that's where the problem starts. Everybody yesterday talked about governance and resources, resource infusion and government. That is where we have failed. We have failed at the point of applying those funds. We may be rich, resources, natural resources, but at the point of applying those funds, then they are diverted. And that's where the problem is. Yeah, you are right. Domestic resource mobilization is a no-brainer, but it is the governance problem that comes in between and destroys the pattern that we are supposed to see, because the strong scavenge on those resources.
So there's no kind of accountability.
There's no accountability. And you can start it from either at an institutional level, political level, and you find that everything comes back to the same thing. But where it has worked, in countries that have succeeded, it has worked very well. In Kenya, for example, domestic resource mobilization using bond market has worked very well. We have created a vibrant bond market. Okay, fine. But of course, everybody would say, did we have adequate resources to roll out the public investment required? The infrastructure deficit is so huge. So over time, I'm sure we will overcome. But that doesn't mean that there are no problems. We want to raise resources. We want to raise, the first thing is the strategy for development. It's the package of policies. Are they right? If those package of development policies are right, then you are going to get resources to fund them. Okay? If they are right, then you are going to see development coming up, and then you are going to see the turnaround. If they are not right, something checks them. It could be the institutional makeup. Then obviously we have to go back and fix the institutions. But it takes a while. Do you remember the question that was asked to the former president?
How long?
And how you have been there. Why didn't it work? And you can see stories differ from country to country, from institutional makeup to institutional makeup. Today I was arguing with someone that we even went ahead to even come up with new constitutions, thinking that they are going to improve the institutions. And they did. But, of course, new constitutions, of course, is like trying a new tool. You find that there are challenges in the initial years. But most countries have realized is maybe this, the institutions are weak because we need to make sure that the constitution is strong and brutal about how institutions should behave. Then we go into a referendum, come up with a new constitution, and we make sure that this will support institutions. But we're still moving on, and you can see that things have worked in some countries that have attempted or created new constitutions. They have created a new era of institutions.
So if I'm hearing you correctly, and I think this was, I don't know if it was you or someone else who mentioned it, the challenge really of domestic resource mobilization is one of domestic resource management.
Yes.
Once you get the management right, the mobilization takes care of itself.
Yes, that is a debate that came up even in my session. And it's a question of, yes, we can raise resources, but how do you manage those resources? And how do you manage those infrastructure projects?
So it's to earn the trust.
Sometimes the management of resources is correct, the infrastructure is correct, but of course, since the deficit is so large, everybody now, politics will come in and say, why did you allocate that road there, not in this location? So we always have those problems. But let me put it, just like you have said, resources can be easy to mobilize if the management of those resources is correct, it is developmental, and it is quite transparent.
Sure. And then just as the
and also efficiency. Efficiency of resource management is one of the main. I don't know where this debate will ever take us. Efficiency of public resource management is something that we've come up with. We have even created laws. Public financial management becomes even a major set of laws of do's and don'ts. So essentially, we're really talking about efficient public resource management. Then obviously transparent in terms of what projects and the benefits of those projects.
And before we close the interview, there was one area that I mentioned I wanted to come back to, and that's the question of the diaspora. Now, the potential of the diaspora has been spoken about in many forums, but tapping into the diaspora has been especially problematic for some countries, whereas for others it has worked very well. What are the kind of, if we're going to mobilize the remittances in the diaspora, in terms of a domestic resource mobilization, what are the politics, what are the considerations that go into that? Because it's a very different animal, you know, when you compare it to broadening a tax base or getting the institutional framework. You're now dealing with a population that actually isn't beholden to you. You know, I can tax you because I can compel you to pay. But a remittance is a voluntary contribution. So what goes into that thinking? What can, in your experience as a central bank governor, but what can governments, what can countries do to better mobilize the resources within their diaspora, both the skill set, but also the money contributions?
You know, remittances actually come in for investment. They come in for investment. They are not handouts for anyone, because sometimes, of course, they send to their relatives to support this or that.
Schooling, healthcare.
Consumption smoothing, healthcare, that kind of thing. But if you look at some countries in Africa, most of the remittances have gone into investment. Now, since the diaspora is sending money for investment, what you're really giving them, and that's why the diaspora board came in, what you're actually giving them is an easier mechanism to invest their financial resources.
So specific sectors or specific projects.
So I'm telling them that we are going to build a dam in such and such an area, and we would like to raise money from the diaspora. This we are going to do to develop a bond that you buy units of the bond, and this is the return, and your returns are going to be
over X amount of time.
X amount of time in a year, and they are going to be stored in your account. So it's a financial investment. Now, the World Bank has spent a lot. There is a department in the World Bank that actually deals with this. I don't know, there's a division. And they have developed so many of those, and they have contracted so many because of the successes they have had in India, in countries in Asia, and some countries in Africa. Essentially because the diaspora are there, you can actually redirect those resources to specific areas where you think can be very important. I don't know, I'm trying to remember the data for Kenya, and it's showing that actually the diaspora is now overtaking all the other export volumes. we are getting about over $100 million a month. So essentially, what you're really saying is that suppose you construct a bond specifically for the diaspora and tell them that you can actually fund development in a particular area and the returns are going to be this. They are going to be very acceptable. But that is the simpler end. And obviously the embassies all over Africa, all over Europe and America, the African embassies deal with that. But there is also a problem. You have to go through handles of registration, because countries like America and Britain are very protective of small investors, because you don't want someone who comes in and get their money and that. So you have to get registration, and that is not difficult. You try to go through that. Personally, I even went the informal way and tried to advertise. Because it's Kenya sharing based, I would go and advertise to the embassies for diaspora, and they would, using the social media, they would all understand, and they can send their money directly. But if you want to do that formally, you can get licenses to do that, and you can and there are institutions that can help to do that. But what we're really saying is that the diaspora will be very, very sensitive to projects that are developmental in nature, and they will come in a big way to fund. But the question is how to develop that. Then once you develop that, how then you have to, the diaspora are also sensitive to see whether there was value for money. Of course, I remember when I tried that, everybody was very active, everybody was very positive. And in fact, it was an infrastructure board that we said we are giving open, because of pricing problems. It's not like a sovereign bond. There is a pricing problem because you are dealing with a domestic diaspora across countries, Dubai.
Lots of areas.
So what we did, the trick I used myself is that we raised an infrastructure bond, and then the price was fixed by the market. It's because it's an auction. So this is the average price, that is the weighted average interest rates. And then we just leave it there and put it on tap. So it means that the diaspora knows the price, and they can put as much money as they want. And that way, it works perfectly. And
everyone can kind of
and
trust
everybody,
the process.
Yeah. So essentially, for domestic investors, it's going to be very difficult for you to condemn them to search for the price.
Yeah.
Search cost is very high. And at the same time, decide how much to invest. You just tell them that we have opened, this is the infrastructure bond, we raised so much, this was the average price, we leave it on tap. And you say, we are leaving it on tap for 2 weeks, and then it's closed, and we got adequate amount of money. And so it means that the diaspora, it all depends on how you can approach the diaspora and how you can construct the products they can actually appreciate. I remember the then Minister for Finance in Kenya was very, very happy about this, because all of a sudden money was like that. Flowing. 2 weeks we closed, and we had enough. So essentially it can be incentive value they can see. Government will not default on its debt, isn't it? It's a sovereign debt. So it doesn't default. So nobody is worried about those aspects.
Yeah, they're safe.
They are safe. The next thing is that you have provided what account. The payments of interest will come to this account. So it is unfettered. Nobody will interfere with it. So essentially it's how you construct, how you understand your diaspora from different regions and all that, and also how you market the projects that you are going to finance with that. It's not just a bond. It's a bond to finance specific targeted projects.
Sure.
That is the game plan. It wins the market.
Sure. And
that's the experience I've had, so it means that it can be shared. But I also ran from other countries because of the World Bank was helping us in terms of constructing that. And we ran from other countries that have done the same thing. So it's no-brainer. It's a question of endogenously deciding this is the best way to go, and secondly, knowing the characteristics of your diaspora, and secondly, knowing what are the national needs, so that everything is applauded on the basis of its value, and it becomes now an incentive to invest in it.
Sure. And as a final kind of parting shot, we like to invite our guests to give their kind of final thought or the key message that they wish the audience takes from this discussion. For you, what would you want anyone watching this to take away from in terms of what needs to be done or what can be done with regards to domestic resource mobilization?
The theme of this African Leadership Forum was about domestic resource mobilization for economic transformation. We need economic transformation. We need to invest. And government needs to invest, it has to provide a large resource infusion to invest in infrastructure to close the infrastructure deficit. The transformation will only come when we have closed the infrastructure gap and enhanced the profitability of private investment. The next question is to ask, who will provide those resources? Because we didn't need a lot of resources. Who will provide them? And that is why domestic resource mobilization becomes a topical issue. Whichever way you start, whether it is taxation, whether it is savings, and that's why we have succeeded in Africa, especially in Kenya and the East African region, and Kenya leading this example in terms of financial inclusion and digitization. It has allowed even the micro savers to participate in the market. It has given banks room to create mountains of deposits. And you can see that sustainable business models are being rolled out in Kenya from across sectors. So essentially, this is a transformation we are seeing. We are seeing that transformation because there has been investment in infrastructure, for example, in payments infrastructure, in telecommunications infrastructure. But we also need physical infrastructure to reach the market. I always say that transformation is about people participating in the market. Economic transformation comes in because people participate in the market. The only way you participate in the market is because you have accessibility to the market. Accessibility to the market requires that you have infrastructure that will take you to the market. Digitally, which has worked very well. Physically, you have to transport your goods to the market. This has happened. This needs to happen. This needs to be efficient. It is lowering transactions cost that everybody will move to the complexity of production, and that is what we are looking for. And that's why I think this conference was very, very timely. We can talk about economic transformation, but one aspect of it is provide resources for that economic transformation.
Well, on that note, thank you very much for joining us in the program, and welcome again soon.
Thank you very much.
Sure.